Soviet Union has close to 250 million inhabitants, divided among almost 100 different nationalities. Of these, by far the largest single group is the Russians. Today, from Russia's old capital, Moscow, the direct power of the USSR reaches over 1/6 of the world's land surface. Before about AD 900, the Russians were no more than scattered Slavonic tribes, inhabiting a vast territory of marsh, forest and steppe in Eastern Europe. Then, with the eastward expansion of the Scandinavian peoples known as Vikings, came early political organization. The first dynasty, the Ruriks, was of Scandinavian origin. So too is the very name Russia. But Russia took her religion and forms of government from the Greek Orthodox world of Byzantium. Two monks, Cyril and Methodius, converted the Eastern Slavs and gave them their alphabet, an adaptation of Greek known as Cyrillic. The land was vast, and there were few towns. Most were little more than stockade-protected villages. But two places did stand out by around AD 1000 with their own spheres of influence. The trading town of Novgorod, through which flowed most of Russia's trade with the north and west, and the golden city of Kiev, with its glittering array of churches and monasteries. Russia became officially Christian with the conversion of the Kievan prince Vladimir in about 988. Although described by one contemporary chronicler as fornicator immensus, Vladimir was later made a saint. His choice of the Eastern Orthodox form of Christianity had a profound effect on Russia's future. After the schism of 1054 between the Latin Church of Rome and the Orthodox Church of Byzantium, Russia and Europe could never kneel together at the same altar. But in the Orthodox tradition, church and state were much closer than they were in the West. Today, in spite of a state policy of atheism, the Russian Orthodox Church still flourishes in certain parts of the USSR. In the 11th and 12th centuries, Russia was closely linked to Western Europe through her Viking traditions and connections. With the Mongol invasions during the 13th century came a breach with the West. The native Russian princes only survived at all by paying tribute to the Mongols, and later to their descendants, the Tatars. 2 centuries of Tatar domination would stamp Russia with customs and traditions far different from those of the West. As the Tatars began to fall out amongst themselves, however, some Russian princes were able to reassert their lost power. The most successful were those of Moscow. Aided by its position near the great trading rivers Volga and Dnieper, in the 14th century this small settlement went from strength to strength. In 1380, Prince Dmitry defeated the Tatars at Kulikovo on the Don, and in the next century Moscow's power grew. In 1480, Ivan III, Grand Prince of Moscow, threw off the Tatar yoke altogether. He claimed sovereignty over the other Russian princes and over the city of Novgorod. He called himself Tsar of all the Russias, using the Slav version of the Latin word Caesar. As Constantinople had fallen to the Turks some years earlier, Ivan also claimed himself to be the new Christian emperor. Moscow is the third Rome, thundered the monk Philotheus. A fourth there shall not be. As Russian strength increased, so the centuries of Mongol and Tatar domination declined. From the beginning of the 16th century, Russia moved steadily eastwards, across the steppe and into Siberia. For hundreds of years, the Russians had been moving out towards the north and northeast, across trackless miles of tundra and forest, subjugating local tribes as they did so, such as the Mari and the Samoyeds. From 1581, they started on the conquest of Siberia. The Stroganovs had acquired the concession of exploiting the Urals. Now they sent a Cossack adventurer, Yermak, to attack this huge Tatar Khanate. With only 850 men, Yermak stormed the capital and opened a path to the east. By 1689, the Russians had reached the shores of the Pacific, a distance of more than 3,000 miles. The border was drawn up with the Chinese at the Treaty of Nerchinsk, and over the next 2 centuries, the Russian hold over Siberia was consolidated. Siberian furs and gold formed an important part of the state's revenues. the huge half-continent was also used for the exiling of political enemies and criminals from the Russian heartland further west. The revenues from Siberia allowed the Tsars in Moscow to build up an army. In addition, much money was spent on attracting European skills to Russia. Ivan III brought in Italian architects like Fioraventi to rebuild the Kremlin, or government fortress in Moscow. This started a tradition of Western buildings that culminated in the 18th century with the construction of a vast new capital, St. Petersburg, at the mouth of the Neva, on the Baltic Sea. Famous for the grand proportions of his buildings, the Italian architect Rastrelli was commissioned to supervise the extension of the Winter Palace. Today, it occupies an area of 400,000 square feet and is about 1/3 of a mile wide. A few miles along the coast to the west of St. Petersburg stands Peterhof. Its transformation into an elegant city from a densely forested area began under Peter the Great in 1707. With its straight avenues and formal gardens, it equals St. Petersburg in its imperial magnificence. Trade between Russia and Western Europe began to grow again during the reign of Ivan the Terrible. The movement of goods took place mainly along the rivers that flowed into the Baltic Sea through ports like Riga and the northern port of Archangel. The first Westerners began to arrive around this time as well. Ivan the Terrible took Kazan from the Tatars with the help of a Danish engineer. English doctors arrived, and so did Scottish mercenaries, although it has to be said that there was always opposition to this westernization process, not least from the archly conservative Russian Orthodox Church. Nevertheless, as the 17th century went ahead, more and more foreigners arrived. And they soon had their own quarter in Moscow, the Arbat, which was a corruption of the German word Arbeit, meaning work. The foreigners were not popular with many Muscovites, especially the old boyar nobility. "Let us not," said one, "imitate the odd and difficult cleanliness of the Germans, who so often wash the floors of their houses, and where a guest may not so much as spit or vomit on the floor." This articulate Muscovite, who spoke up so eloquently for the leisured classes of 17th century Moscow, could not have known the work of the English cartoonist Rowlandson a century later. But doubtless he would have approved at least of the content of his satirical drawings. Nevertheless, Westerners thronged into the armies of the Tsars. The Lermontov and Barclay de Tolly families came straight from Scotland, along with the Gordons in the 17th century. 100 years later, there were so many Germans in the Russian army that instruction manuals were written in German as well as Russian. Today, the Red Army marches with the goose step, and its titles for ranks are a straight copy of the same titles in German. Ivan the Terrible and his successors hoped these Westerners would help conquer their traditional enemies, the Tatars, and capture the old Hanseatic cities of the Baltic. But what kind of men were the Tsars becoming? Ivan the Terrible ranks as one of the great butchers of Russian history. He came to the throne at the age of 3 and ruled for over 50 years. He had some success in foreign wars, but at home and abroad, his greatest talent was for murder, mutilation, and massacre. He killed Russians as well as foreigners, princes as well as peasants. He suffered periodic bouts of intense remorse and repentance, perhaps never more so than when he swung his steel-tipped staff in a temper and smashed the skull of his favorite son and heir. Much later, the painter Repin depicted the event in this harrowing 19th century study. Ivan suffered much in his boyhood at the hands of various degenerate members of the old Russian aristocratic class, the boyars. Later, this caused him to develop an acute paranoia and to see conspiracies everywhere. He began to systematically eradicate the power of the boyars, giving land and power to his own men, and thereby creating a new nobility to replace the old. In 1564, he set up the Oprichnina, his own private army of licensed gangsters. These trained killers were responsible for the murder of monks and anyone else who got in Ivan's way. The boyars were systematically weakened, murdered or banished to the far corners of the empire, distant places like Kazan, Siberia, and Astrakhan. In this way, Russia lost that class of nobility that, in the West, guaranteed civil liberties and private rights. Ivan knew that the secret of power was the ownership of land, so he systematically took it away from the old nobility and gave it to his oprichniks. But no one was given hereditary rights to these lands. Instead, Ivan rewarded his followers by giving them greater powers of serfdom over the peasantry. That was the single greatest act in the 16th century that produced the character of Russia. More and more, people were bound to the soil, unable to escape their master, unable to marry without his permission. In the short term, this ensured that the land would be cultivated, and serfdom grew with pure military force as the 16th century turned into the 17th. In the 18th century, the system of serfdom became near universal. At first, there was so much land available that people didn't really notice it very much. But after a time, the nobles' exactions became so great that the serfs began to fight back. Russian history in the 17th and 18th centuries was marked by vast revolts of the peasants. These upheavals were ruthlessly put down by public torture and an ingenious array of methods of execution. To escape, many peasants had fled to places like the Crimea on the Black Sea coast and Saratov on the Volga. There they were free from Tsarist tyranny. There too there were Cossacks, freebooters and nomads who had always resented government control. These Cossacks produced two vast upheavals that shook the fabric of Russian society. Stenka Razin in the 17th century, and in the 18th century, the Cossack rebel leader, Pugachev. Both men gave the Tsars in Moscow great cause for concern before they were captured and executed. During the centuries following the death of Ivan the Terrible, Russia was an open prey to the West. Adventurous Poles wanted land, and so did the Swedes. The Roman Catholic Church of Poland launched a crusade to rid its eastern neighbor of the dreaded orthodoxy. Meanwhile, Russia fell prey to a succession of pretenders. The most successful was the false Dmitri. Supported by the Poles, he seized Moscow, but he was expelled by an alliance of the boyars and the mob of Moscow. In 1613, a new Tsar was elected, Mikhail Romanov. The time of troubles, which had begun with the death of Ivan the Terrible, was succeeded by a new era of consolidation and expansion. The Cossacks in the Ukraine felt strong enough to revolt against their Polish masters. Under their leader, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, they forced the Poles to retire to the west. After this, the Ukraine came under Russia. It was a rich area with enormous potential. Its peoples were mainly Orthodox in religion, and their language was a cross between Polish and Russian. The Ukraine provided revenue and soldiers, although the Cossack freebooters, as always, resented the attempts of the government in Moscow to bring them to heel. They were strong enough to frustrate all attempts to control them until the early 18th century. Peter the Great was 9 years old when he came to the throne in 1682. Not everybody approved his accession. The Moscow garrison marched on the Kremlin and spent 3 days murdering every relative and friend of Peter's mother they could lay their hands on. Peter himself and his mother were spared, but the massacre planted in Peter a loathing for Moscow which would stay with him throughout his life. Peter the Great had a dramatic impact on pre-revolutionary Russia. He was determined to turn old-fashioned Muscovy into a modern European state, as great as any other. To revenge himself on Moscow, he ordered the construction of a vast new capital city to be built at St. Petersburg. 150,000 serfs died in the fetid Neva swamps to fulfill Peter the Great's dream of a capital that would rival Versailles in its scale and splendor. Peter had moved his court to the western edge of his vast empire. It was almost as if he wanted to shout to the emperors and kings of Europe that he had arrived, that Russia was now truly a part of the West. As the intellectual Chadaev said in the 19th century, Peter the Great found only a blank sheet of paper and wrote on it, Europe and the West. Since then, we have belonged to Europe and the West. But if life in the palaces of St. Petersburg was as regal and splendid as in any court in Europe, in the villages of Russia, the people lived in rags. Under Peter, the power of the state, already very strong in the Byzantine and Tatar traditions, grew to the point where the kind of liberties that the West took for granted did not properly develop. The people remained poor and crushed, locked into their own old world of superstition, orthodoxy, and primitive agriculture. Here, as the 18th century developed, was the Russia, as Trotsky was to call it, of icons and cockroaches. Peter's Russia was a place where first-class batteries of horse artillery galloped through mud villages, and in those villages lived 97% of the Russian people. Peter's reforms consisted of an external westernization, best illustrated in the law he introduced against beards. The Russian people modeled their beards on those of the saints. As a contemporary said, nothing but the terror of having them pulled out by the roots could ever have persuaded the Ruses to part with them. Some shaven workers in St. Petersburg kept their beards in their pockets to show to St. Nicholas on Judgment Day. For generations, the great battle in Russia was really between the beards and the non-beards, between those who wanted to reject the West and those who wanted to lose themselves in it. The Russian nobility had few doubts. They became little Peter the Greats, imitating Western forms more and more. It was said in the 18th century that the Muscovite goes to Paris a little piglet and comes back a perfect swine. They spoke bad French in preference to Russian and began to despise orthodoxy. They were also considerable drinkers, one old theme of Russia that Peter the Great did not remove, but rather indulged. After having gulped down a dozen bumpers of Hungarian wine, said a German diplomat, the Vice Tsar gave me a full quart of brandy, which I had to empty in 2 draughts. I soon lost my senses, though the rest of the guests, asleep already on the floor, were in no condition to make reflections on my little skill in drinking. As a young man, Peter the Great delighted in disguising himself and mingling with his people, whether as a ship's carpenter, as in this illustration, in his own shipyards, or carousing the night away with dubious friends in Moscow's Arbat district. He was at one and the same time a larger-than-life character and an evil genius. He could wreak a terrible revenge on those who crossed him and dream up methods of execution and torture as gruesome as anything carried out by Ivan the Terrible. But he did little to make the life as a Tsar of Russia any more secure for his successors. The brains of Peter III were bashed out with a footstool by his wife's lover. Tsar Paul was assassinated with a curtain cord by noble conspirators and with the connivance of his own son Alexander. The rule of the Tsarist court was that any relaxation of the severities of rule was fatal. This lesson was learned by Peter's formidable daughter, Elizabeth, who preferred to leave the business of government to Ukrainian upstarts and the Baltic Germans. It was also fully absorbed by Catherine II, the Great, who imported Westerners and Western fashions wholesale, and who did most to build up St. Petersburg. What made this possible was the increasing strength of Russian arms. Peter the Great defeated the Swedes, the Cossacks, and the Poles. He annexed the Baltic coast, where in the old Hanseatic towns there was a large class of educated people. The deployment of these people and of the Baltic nobility allowed the resources of the Ukraine to be developed. The combination of these two in the last third of the 18th century gave Tsarist Russia, under Catherine the Great, a vast power. During the Napoleonic Wars, the Russian armies were, by the standards of the time, inexhaustible. And although they remained a very Russian mixture of the hopelessly inefficient and the daringly modern, they sufficed, in 1812-13, to defeat Napoleon. For the next 40 years, Tsarist Russia was the great reactionary power of Europe, until her defeat in the Crimean War of 1854. Then, too, the power of the state inside Russia began to decline. In 1857, Tsar Alexander II declared in a momentous speech, "It is better to abolish serfdom from above than to wait for it to abolish itself from below." The Tsars had exploited their people, especially through the system of serfdom. For most of the time, the peasants could be kept down, because at least they had land to farm. But there always had been an underground of popular resentment. Agriculture remained poor and backward. Population went up at a dizzying rate, and that meant starvation. The only answer seemed to be to bring in industry on a large scale, and so take away people from the land. But industry could only come with foreigners' help, and huge Western investment went into Russia to develop railways and oil wells and very large factories, where a poorly paid workforce was ordered around for the benefit, very often, of foreign investors and the Tsarist autocracy. In the 18th century, the Cossack rebel Emelian Pugachev had almost toppled the regime of Catherine the Great. Frightened that such an event would be repeated, Alexander II had abolished serfdom altogether in the 19th century. But even that would not now be enough to prevent a much greater clash in the early years of the 20th century. For the Tsars of Russia, time was running out.